During the early period of slavery, specifically during the Portuguese and Spanish domination of the slave trade, no European institution was involved at the level the Roman Catholic Church was. And it would all start with the Portuguese. Let's back up just a wee bit. I put 1441, the year that the slave trade commenced. Prince Henry the Navigator was a great Portuguese seaman. He raided the Mauritanian villages off the coast of Africa to capture Africans for slave labor in 1441. Endorsed and financed by the Pope to enslave infidels and unbelievers, that is Muslims, once sugar was discovered and the wealth derived from it, the enslavement of the African by the Portuguese grew dramatically. Between 1441 and 1470, at least 1,000 African slaves were transported to Portugal every year, while the 50-year period between 1450 and 1500, close to 150,000 Africans enslaved were transported to Lisbon alone. As the 16th century dragged on, Portugal and Spain assumed staggering levels of wealth from spice, sugar, cinnamon, gold, nutmeg, rubies, silk, and other riches, all extracted by slave labor from Africa. The endorsement of the Catholic Church in all of this was essential. Between 1445 and 1481, there were 4 papal bulls, capital B, established in an effort to give the sovereignty of the slave trade to the Portuguese. The popes, they were Eugenius IV, Nicholas V, under whom 2 bulls were issued in 1450 and 1454, and Sixtus IV. All of these popes attempted to monopolize, in the name of the church, the slave trade for Portugal. As long as Portugal and Spain were to dominate the trade, the church would remain a faithful broker. A major book you should read. It's a little old now, but you should read it. It was published in the 1970s, written by Keith Irvine. It's called The Rise of the Colored Races. In the year 1488, Pope Innocent the Fifth, gave a gift of African slaves to his cardinals and other Catholic houses. The Pope had earlier received 100 Africans as a gift from King Ferdinand of Spain. A gift. The Christian Church had long accepted and even advocated slavery as part of the consequence of original sin. Thus, slavery was never considered by the church in Europe as an evil or inhuman system. And while Catholics did urge the baptism of those enslaved into the church, no one ever opposed slavery on moral or religious grounds, though Pope Pius II on October 7, 1462, severely criticized the enslavement of Christians who were Africans. All of this began with Prince Henry and the Portuguese in 1440. Unofficially, however, and in the judgment of most historians, the African slave trade commenced in whole in 1517, when the Catholic Bishop of Spain, Bartolomé de la Casa, urged King Charles V of Spain not to continue the enslavement of Indians on Spain's island possessions, lest they become annihilated because of the severity of the land. Go ahead. Especially in the mines. De la Casa instead offered that Spain should consider utilizing Africans as slaves. Africans were plentiful, they were stronger and more likely to endure. This was not a precedent, because earlier in 1509, the King of Spain, Ferdinand, had favored replacing Indian slaves with Africans due to the growing shortage of Indians. In fact, on January 22nd, 1510, according to historian Hugh Thomas, Ferdinand approved the shipment of 50 Africans to work the mines in Hispaniola. Not only did King Charles encourage to end Indian slavery by de la Casa, but other Spanish officials as well. And like de la Casa, citing the impending annihilation of the Indian labor force. Charles V had succeeded his father as king and was only 18 years old and doubtlessly impressionable. Not long after Spain began to intensify African slave labor, violence within that system erupted. The first major slave revolt on land resulting from the slave trade occurred in Hispaniola when Africans rebelled in 1522. Other revolts by Africans followed in Santo Domingo in 1533, Puerto Rico in 1527, Colombia 1529, in Mexico, then called New Spain, in 1537, in Cartagena in 1545, and in Panama in 1552. Substituting African for Indian slave labor did not in all instances make for a smooth transition. The earliest destinations for African slaves to the New World as late as 1640 was South and Central America. 150,000 Africans to Peru, 80,000 Africans to New Spain, 45,000 Africans to Colombia, 12,000 Africans to Venezuela, and 16,000 in the Antilles. In these areas were the brunt of the Spanish slave. Charles V yielded to de la Casa's plea, and in the year 1518, the enslavement of Africans irreversibly commenced. Protestant England joined the fray in 1562, and within 100 years, all of the European power nations were involved. There's a very exacerbated condemnation of the Christian church's role in the slave trade, written by a Jewish labor historian, Chapman Cohen. Read his book, Christianity, Slavery, and Labor. Also, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois' classic work, The World and Africa. The slave trade was merciless, barbaric, and was epitomized in all its horror by the devastating and traumatic transference of African people from their homeland to various destinations of the so-called New World. Sure. But it would not be until the 16th century before the trade would become immense. From 1441 until the turn of the century, the Portuguese controlled the trade for its own purposes, raiding Guinea coastlines to obtain human beings. During the 16th century, the Portuguese were joined by Spain, Holland, England, and France, and the wholesale destruction of Africa had begun. England had wanted to enter the slave trade earlier, at least by 1481, but were somewhat asked by the Spaniards to hold off until they did. Now, we come now to the Maafa. I want everyone to please listen carefully to this. While the exact number will never be known, right? It is estimated in modest terms that at least 70 to 100 million Africans were taken from Africa during the 418 years of the transatlantic slave trade. The staggering statistic is that only 25% of the total taken survived the ocean voyage. This we refer to as the Maafa, the greatest historical tragedy of African peoples. Dr. Philip Curtin of the University of Wisconsin, he just recently passed, but in his lifetime, perhaps the premier historian on the demographics of the slave trade, has postulated that only 9 to 14 million Africans actually reached the shores of the New World. This figure was first published in 1969, but has since been upscaled due to more recent scholarship in this area, where it is now assumed that the truer figure should read 14 to 20 million who survived the journey. And though scholarship in this area differs, it is remarkably close, if you can kind of get these in your mind. For instance, Professor Noel Deere offers the figure, these are survivors, as 11,970,000. Dr. Joseph Inakori of the University of Rochester, 15 million. Charles Wally, 11,345,000. Professor Paul Lovejoy, 11,863,000. The French historian Jean-Michel Duveau, 11,500, and this figure was from 1994. And in 1997, Dr. Hugh Thomas, 11 million. Read Dr. Thomas's book, The Slave Trade. The Story of the Atlantic Slave Trade, 1440-1870, was published in 1998. Now, in terms of the destinations reached by Africans, the approximate numbers are as follows. 4 million Africans were landed in Brazil. 2,500,000 to the Spanish colonies, 2 million to the Caribbean, 1,600,000 to the French West Indies, 500,000 to British North America, 500,000 to the Dutch West Indies, 28,000 to the Danish West Indies, and 200,000 directly to Europe, mostly to Portugal. Now, for an evaluation of Curtin's critical work, there is a book that followed called The Impact of the Atlantic Slave Trade on Africa, a review of the literature. This was published in the Journal of African History, written by Paul Lovejoy, 1989. It stands thus far. While these figures that we have given you are approximate, the fact of the matter is that the majority of Africans kidnapped for the purposes of slave labor never, ever reach their destination. Now, this is a huge figure. Total kidnapped Africans. This is still under study, and a more compatible figure is probably between 60 and 70 million. However, of all of the millions who were kidnapped, millions more died before reaching the Americas. Millions died from the brutal slave marches of Arabs and Africans bringing enslaved people from the interior to the coast. Millions died while waiting at slave fort castles or in barracoons until slave ships could be obtained. Many more were simply murdered by Arab and African slave catchers, but the majority would die at sea. Millions of Africans died en route as a result of the terrible conditions they were forced to undergo. Africans perished either by disease, starvation, dehydration, suicide, murder at the hands of white seamen, or attempting mutinies. The ocean crossing in all of its tragic despair is identified historically as the Middle Passage. We now call it the Maafa. The horrible, cramped, non-ventilated, and unsanitary section of a slave ship where several hundred to 1,000 Africans depending on the size of a ship. Women, men, children were chained for months, being relieved spasmodically to exercise on deck. Ronald Childs, in his compelling article, The Middle Passage Continues, indicates that the transatlantic slave trade was the greatest forced migration of human beings ever undertaken since the dawning of recorded history. This is the Maafa. Now, there have been several scholarly works written describing from primary and secondary sources the transatlantic slave trade. In order to compare data and in order to reach some comprehension regarding demographics, the serious student of African-American history should consult the following books, beginning with the first major study of the matter. Now, I did set you up nicely. I told you that I'm a history professor, and I have to always validate what I share. The first major modern story of this matter is called The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States of America, 1638 to 1870, written by the great scholar, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Daniel Mannix, his book, Black Cargoes. James Hennessy, his book, Sins of the Fathers. The Atlantic Slave Trade by Philip Curtin. Slavery and Social Death by Orlando Patterson. The African Slave Trade by Basil Davidson. From Slavery to Freedom by John Hope Franklin. The Rise of the Colored Races by Keith Irvine, especially the chapter titled Black Ivory, the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Another book, Introduction to African Civilization by John G. Jackson, and an excellent compendium co-edited by Joseph E. Anakori, Professor of History at the University of Rochester, and Dr. Stanley L. Ingerman, Professor of Economics and History, also at the U of Austin. In 1992, they collaborated to publish a book called The Atlantic Slave Trade: Effects on Economics, Societies, and Peoples in Africa, the Americas, and Europe. This major study attempts to examine and reassess the many demographic variables of the slave trade. And though somewhat sympathetic to the historic unfulfilled promises of capitalism, it is nonetheless superbly contributed to by several international scholars of the slave trade, and is a work that should be seriously read. And the very serious student should also try to find, it's very difficult to find, a book called Extracts from the Records of the African Companies, written by Ruth Fisher of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. Very valuable brief reading would also include an essay written by the Caribbean scholar C.L.R. James. His The Atlantic Slave Trade and Slavery, subtitled Some Interpretations of Their Significance in the Development of the United States and the Western World. This very strong piece can be read in a collection of essays titled Amistad, Writings in Black History and Culture, edited by John Williams and Charles Harris. Hurrying on now. The slave voyages were ghastly. During these voyages, frustrated white sailors took their resentment out on the Africans. It was common practice for African women to be gang raped, sick Africans thrown over the side to the sharks, and for defiant Africans to be murdered. At times, African men who could be identified as tribal spiritual leaders were killed or had their tongues cut out. Identifying these men was crucial because to the West African, the shaman, the religious leader, was the primary religious influence who held the loyalty and the command of his people almost without exception. Once understanding this cultural phenomenon of African people, slave catchers would attempt to limit their powers in any way possible, by tribal separation if they could, and by more drastic measures if need be, as stated a moment ago. Not only were attempts made to separate the African spiritual leaders, but the attempt was also made to conscientiously and as carefully as possible separate the African by tribe and language, also as a method of disrupting African communication, which became a necessary tactic in order to guard against and prevent resistance and revolt. It didn't work because there was one form of communication that was similar throughout all of Africa, and that was the drum. If I'm in then Tanganyika, and another brother was from, let's say, Mauritania, we couldn't speak, we couldn't verbalize because we had different languages, but the one thing that we understood was the beating of the drum. During the Black Liberation struggle, we used to sign our letters, Dr. Anderson, let the drums tick. I appreciate Brother Aaron. I appreciate very much. It's a young man. The European, with a religious temperament, but clearly without a moral, felt that Africans were a blessing from God, by blacks being believed to be stronger and physically more resilient than indigenous Indians and far more numerous and conspicuous than white indentured servants and far more abundant. They were thought a natural tool for the economic development of the so-called New World. This obviously being an extension on the earlier thought of Bishop de la Casa's resolution to the perpetuation of slavery. Now, it may be of interest to note here that the first use of the term Negro was not made until the year 1551, when an Englishman named Richard Eden translated into English a Spanish document called Decades, written by Peter Martyr, and found the term being used interchangeably with Ethiopia. Now, whether this was the first account or not, it is a fact that the term Negro was not created by black people. It was an invention of white men to describe who we were. Now, we must note the importance that during the early period of the slave trade, the Calvinist ethic of predestination and divine selection was gaining religious momentum, particularly among the Dutch. This would give the European a totally new conceptual philosophy of both oppressive religion and economics, of the interdependence of the two, and was to set in motion the future tone of continued black subjugation that was to exist long after the abolition of slavery. Slavery, religion, and economics formed an unholy trinity. In most instances, the European church leadership favored the institution of slavery as being in harmony with the will of God and as suitable to his purposes of white civilization. It certainly was compatible with the new Christian economic theories of capitalism. We may not understand this, but capitalism started with European Christian church, based on formulations by a man named John Calvin.
Go ahead.
But clearly, the expansion of both Catholic and Protestant land ventures in the so-called New World were understood simultaneously as religious and as economic exploits. Contemporary scholars of economic economic theory and a smaller number of historians on the matter have been reluctant to equate capitalism with the profit motive of the slave trade. But there are 4 works, and I'm closing. There are 4 works, 3 of them extant, that articulate capitalism's marriage with slavery. The greatest of these is from the great German social ethicist and historian, Professor Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R. His book, I strongly suggest you read it if you haven't. Although it was written over 70 years ago, it is extremely timely and relevant. It is called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. R.H. Tawney, an Englishman, wrote Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Eric Williams's classic work on the subject, the former president of Trinidad, Capitalism and Slavery. Those 3 are accessible, but there is an unpublished thesis called Africa and the Rise of Capitalism, written by Wilson Williams of Howard University. This was his master's thesis. It has never been published in book form, unfortunately, but it remains at the Howard University Library and is accessible through microfilm. So if you're a serious student, and you really want to deal with this evil, I would suggest that you certainly concentrate on this book. You know, I'm really feeling it now.
Go ahead, Talib.
In my church, I start preaching about 20 minutes of 12. And about 12:15, they're looking at their watches. But I'm feeling it at 12:15. I can go on and on and on. But asante sana to you.
Amen. Amen.